Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the middle of the 19th century, was not a place that inspired thoughts of marble halls or landscaped estates. It was a city of smoke and slag, of riverbanks crowded with mills, where wealth was extracted violently from coal seams and iron ore and converted into power with relentless efficiency. This was where the Mellon story truly began, long before the family's name became associated with grand houses, European art, or cultural patronage. The Mellon mansions were not the origin of the fortune. They were its consequence. The family's American story starts with Thomas Mellon, an Irish immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1818 with little more than an education and a belief in discipline, thrift, and control. He settled in western Pennsylvania, became a lawyer, then a judge, and eventually turned to banking, founding what would become Mellon Bank. Thomas Mellon was not a romantic figure. He distrusted debt, despised speculation, and viewed money as a tool of leverage rather than display. His worldview would define the family for generations. The Mellons did not seek visibility. They sought position. That philosophy found its most powerful expression in his son, Andrew William Mellon. Born in 1855, Andrew Mellon came of age as America industrialized at a scale never seen before. Steel, aluminum, oil, railroads, chemicals, and electricity were not abstract markets to him. They were systems to be financed, consolidated, and quietly controlled. Mellon capital flowed into companies that would define American industry, including Alcoa, Gulf Oil, Westinghouse, and countless steel and coal ventures. By the early 20th century, Andrew Mellon was one of the richest men in the world, though most Americans had never heard his name. Unlike contemporaries such as Rockefeller or Carnegie, Mellon avoided public spectacle. He did not cultivate a myth. He cultivated influence. That influence reached its peak when he became Secretary of the Treasury in 1921, a position he would hold for 11 years under 3 presidents. In that role, Mellon helped shape federal tax policy, debt repayment, and the financial architecture of the modern American state. His fingerprints were on the economy itself. Yet, even at the height of his power, Mellon lived carefully, almost austerely by the standards of the ultra-wealthy. This restraint is critical to understanding the Mellon mansions that would come later. When the family eventually built or acquired grand residences, they were not expressions of excess. They were statements of legitimacy. Old money in Europe announced itself through land, lineage, and stone. New money in America had to learn the same language. The Mellons did not rush to speak it. They waited until their position was unassailable. By the early 20th century, Mellon wealth had become generational, institutional, and permanent. The question was no longer how to make money, but how to anchor it in history. The mansions would answer that question. They would serve not as celebrations, but as fortifications. Places designed to endure, to separate the family from the industrial chaos that created their fortune, and to project an image of stability in a nation defined by constant change. Before the Mellon family built great houses, they built the financial machinery of modern America. Everything that followed rested on that foundation. Pittsburgh in the late 19th century was not merely the backdrop of the Mellon fortune. It was its proving ground. The city sat at the confluence of 3 rivers, its geography perfectly suited for heavy industry, and by the 1880s it had become one of the most productive industrial centers on Earth. Smoke hung permanently in the air. Daylight was often reduced to a yellow haze. Steel mills roared day and night, and entire neighborhoods existed to serve the furnaces, rail yards, and factories that lined the riverbanks. This was not a place associated with elegance or leisure, but it was where American power was being forged. For the Mellons, Pittsburgh was not something to escape from at first. It was something to dominate. As the Mellon fortune expanded through banking, steel, coal, and aluminum, the family's physical presence in the city became more deliberate. Wealth in 19th century America did not announce itself immediately through isolated country estates. Instead, it clustered. The industrial elite gathered along specific corridors where proximity signaled status and control. In Pittsburgh, that corridor was Fifth Avenue. Stretching eastward from downtown toward Oakland and Shadyside, Fifth Avenue became known as Millionaires' Row, a dense concentration of mansions owned by the city's most powerful families. This was where money took architectural form, not as retreat, but as declaration. The Mellons built and acquired residences along Fifth Avenue not to impress the public, but to situate themselves among equals. These houses were large but not flamboyant. They reflected restraint, solidity, and permanence. Heavy stone facades, conservative classical proportions, and interiors designed for privacy, rather than spectacle, define Mellon architecture in Pittsburgh. Unlike the flamboyant excess seen in some Gilded Age mansions elsewhere in the country, Mellon homes avoided theatricality. They were built to endure Pittsburgh's smoke, winters, and scrutiny. They were expressions of confidence rather than bravado. Andrew Mellon's primary Pittsburgh residence stood near the institutional core of the city, close to Mellon Bank and other financial centers where decisions that shaped entire industries were made. The location was not incidental. Distance from the mills did not mean disengagement from industry. It meant oversight. From these homes, the Mellons could conduct business, host private meetings, and exercise influence without exposing themselves to the chaos below. Architecture functioned as insulation, both literal and symbolic, separating capital from labor, decision-makers from production. These houses also reflected the Mellon philosophy toward wealth. The family believed deeply in control of assets, control of risk, control of public perception. Their Pittsburgh residences embodied this mindset. Rooms were designed for contained gatherings rather than grand balls. Gardens were enclosed rather than expansive. The goal was not to entertain society, but to maintain order. Even servants' quarters and service corridors were meticulously planned, ensuring that the machinery of domestic life operated invisibly, mirroring the way Mellon capital functioned in the broader economy. Yet despite this restraint, the scale of Mellon influence was unmistakable. By the early 20th century, the family's properties formed part of a broader ecosystem of elite power. Neighbors included industrialists, financiers, and executives whose companies employed tens of thousands of workers. Deals were discussed over dinner tables that sat just miles from steel mills where wages were fought over and lives were shortened by industrial accidents. The physical closeness of wealth and industry in Pittsburgh created a tension that defined the city. The Mellons were acutely aware of it. Pittsburgh itself bore the marks of this concentration of power. Cultural institutions, universities, hospitals, and libraries expanded alongside private wealth, often with Mellon money flowing quietly behind the scenes. The family understood that permanence required legitimacy, and legitimacy required institutions. Their mansions were part of a larger strategy that linked private residence to public influence. Living in Pittsburgh was not merely about comfort. It was about stewardship, visibility within elite circles, and the projection of stability in a volatile industrial environment. As the 20th century progressed, however, the limitations of the city became impossible to ignore. Industrial pollution worsened. Labor unrest grew more frequent. Strikes and violent reminded Pittsburgh's elites that their fortunes rested on fragile social arrangements. The air itself became a symbol of industrial excess, coating buildings and lungs alike. For families like the Mellons, whose wealth was increasingly global and financial rather than purely industrial, the city began to feel less like a command center and more like a liability. This shift did not happen suddenly. The Mellons did not abandon Pittsburgh overnight. Instead, their relationship with the city evolved. Pittsburgh remained the birthplace of their fortune and the anchor of their institutional power. But it no longer satisfied their desire for privacy, cultural refinement, or distance from the consequences of industrialization. The mansions along Fifth Avenue, once symbols of dominance, began to feel constrained. Surrounded by urban growth, traffic, and expanding universities, these homes lost the isolation that had once defined elite living. At the same time, American wealth itself was changing. The Gilded Age model of urban mansions near centers of commerce gave way to a new ideal, the country estate. Land, not proximity, became the ultimate marker of status. Space offered security. Distance offered control. For families like the Mellons, whose wealth no longer required daily oversight of factories, the logic of remaining embedded in an industrial city weakened. Yet the Pittsburgh mansions were essential transitional objects in the Mellon story. They represent the moment when financial power first took architectural form. These were not yet the sprawling estates that would later define the family's image, but they established the principles that would guide all Mellon residences going forward. Solidity over show. Privacy over publicity. Control over indulgence. The houses along Fifth Avenue were the physical manifestation of a dynasty learning how to exist in public without being exposed. As the Mellons began to look eastward, toward quieter valleys and more controlled landscapes, Pittsburgh remained behind as a kind of origin site. The city had given them everything: capital, influence, and legitimacy. But it also embodied the costs of industrial modernity that the family increasingly wished to escape. The smoke-darkened mansions, once monuments to success, became reminders of a phase that had run its course in time. Many of these houses would be demolished, repurposed, or absorbed by expanding institutions. The street that had once concentrated unimaginable private wealth would transform into a corridor of universities, hospitals, and offices. The physical traces of Mellon domestic life in Pittsburgh would fade, even as the institutions they helped finance endured. This erasure was not accidental. It mirrored the Mellons' own evolution from visible industrial elites into quieter stewards of capital and culture. Section 2 of the Mellon mansion story is therefore not about grandeur in the traditional sense. It is about positioning. Pittsburgh was where the Mellon family learned how to translate money into space, how to use architecture as an extension of financial philosophy, and how to exist at the center of American industrial power without becoming consumed by it. The mansions of Pittsburgh were not the destination. They were the bridge between raw accumulation and dynastic legacy. Everything that followed would build upon the lessons learned in a city of smoke, steel, and carefully guarded doors. By the second decade of the 20th century, the Mellon family had crossed an invisible threshold. The accumulation phase was effectively over. The fortune was no longer vulnerable to market swings, individual failures, or the death of a single patriarch. It had become structural, embedded in banks, corporations, trusts, and government policy itself. What remained was a different challenge, one that confronted every American family that had grown rich too quickly. Money could be made in a generation. Permanence could not. The Mellons understood that survival as a dynasty required a shift in priorities. And that shift would transform how they lived, where they lived, and why they built. Andrew Mellon's rise to national power crystallized this transformation. Appointed Secretary of the Treasury in 1921, he entered public life at a moment when the United States was redefining itself as a global economic force. Mellon did not behave like a politician. He behaved like a banker overseeing a system. Tax policy, debt reduction, and federal finance were treated not as ideological battlegrounds but as engineering problems. The country's finances were something to be optimized, stabilized, and quietly managed. This technocratic approach reinforced the Mellon belief that true power operated best when unseen. That belief had architectural consequences. Urban mansions near factories and financial districts had served their purpose during the era of accumulation, when oversight and proximity mattered. But a family that now operated at the level of national policy and international finance required insulation from both public scrutiny and political volatility. The question was no longer how close one lived to the center of power, but how effectively one could withdraw from it while retaining influence. The Mellon family's domestic life began to reflect this recalibration. The concept of legacy entered the foreground. In Europe, aristocratic families had long used land and estates to convert wealth into continuity. Property anchored identity. It slowed time. In America, where fortunes were often new and mobile, this model had to be imported deliberately. For the Mellons, the move toward large country properties and carefully curated residences was not an affectation. It was a strategic adaptation. Architecture would do what markets could not: create the appearance of inevitability. Andrew Mellon himself embodied this contradiction. He was one of the most powerful men in America, yet deeply uncomfortable with public attention. He avoided flamboyant displays of wealth and rarely cultivated popular affection. His temperament was reserved, analytical, and private. The homes associated with him reflected this sensibility. They were designed to withdraw rather than impress, to impose order rather than inspire awe. Even as the scale of Mellon residences increased, their tone remained controlled, almost austere. This shift also marked a change in how the family related to time. Industrial fortunes were made quickly and could be lost just as fast. Dynasties thought in generations. Estate planning, trusts, and philanthropic foundations became central tools for extending influence beyond individual lifespans. Residences were now conceived as long-term assets, places that could outlast their builders and serve multiple generations. The Mellon family was no longer building houses for themselves alone. They were building containers for inheritance. Geography followed philosophy. The family began to look beyond Pittsburgh's industrial basin toward landscapes that offered separation, beauty, and control. Rolling countryside, private valleys, and large tracts of land became preferable to dense urban streets. These environments allowed for scale without exposure. A mansion set on hundreds of acres did not need to announce itself. Its power was implicit in its isolation. Access could be regulated. Visibility could be managed. This was also a period in which American society was renegotiating the meaning of wealth. The excesses of the Gilded Age had provoked backlash. Progressive reforms, income taxes, and antitrust actions signaled that public tolerance for conspicuous consumption had limits. For families like the Mellons, restraint was not just personal preference. It was political necessity. Mansions could no longer function as public statements of dominance. They had to appear responsible, cultivated, and justified. The Mellons responded by aligning architecture with culture. Their residences increasingly functioned as private museums, libraries, and galleries. Art collecting became central, not as decoration, but as legitimization. European paintings, sculptures, and tapestries carried historical weight that industrial wealth lacked. Displaying culture suggested stewardship rather than indulgence. It reframed wealth as guardianship of civilization itself. This reorientation laid the groundwork for Andrew Mellon's most enduring public legacy, the National Gallery of Art. The museum was not an isolated act of generosity. It was the culmination of a philosophy that blurred the line between private residence and public institution. The art that once filled Mellon homes would ultimately be transferred to the nation, converting private prestige into permanent cultural authority. In doing so, the Mellons accomplished something few industrial dynasties managed. They transformed wealth into memory within the family. This shift was not without tension. The next generation inherited not only enormous resources but also enormous expectations. Living within houses designed to embody restraint, permanence, and cultural authority could feel constraining. These were not homes built for spontaneity or reinvention. They were structures that assumed continuity. Children raised within them were expected to fit into a pre-existing narrative. The scale of these residencies reinforced that expectation. Staffed by servants, managed by caretakers, and governed by routines that emphasized order, Mellon homes functioned almost as institutions themselves. Daily life unfolded within a framework designed to minimize disorder and unpredictability. This environment reinforced the family's values, but it also distanced them from the broader society whose labor sustained their fortune. As the Mellons completed their transition from industrial financiers to cultural stewards, the role of the mansion became fully defined. It was no longer simply a place to live. It was a buffer between the family and the world, a physical manifestation of a new social contract. The family would withdraw from public view, but in exchange they would offer stability, philanthropy, and cultural leadership. This transformation marked the true beginning of the Mellon Mansion era. The buildings that followed would be larger, more isolated, and more refined than anything constructed during the Pittsburgh years. They would sit on land rather than streets, overlook valleys rather than factories, and prioritize continuity over commerce. But their purpose remained consistent with everything that had come before. They were instruments of control, designed to preserve a fortune that had already reshaped the American economy. By the time Andrew Mellon stepped down from public office in 1932, the foundation of the Mellon dynasty had been fully converted. Wealth had become legacy. Industry had given way to institution. And architecture had emerged as the medium through which this transformation was made visible. The mansions were no longer simply reflections of success. They were assertions that the Mellon family intended to remain, long after the furnaces cooled and the smoke cleared, as permanent fixtures in the American story. As the Mellon family's influence expanded beyond Pittsburgh, geography itself became a strategic instrument. Power in early 20th century America no longer resided solely in industrial cities. It migrated eastward toward New York's financial markets and Washington's political machinery. For a family whose wealth had become national in scope, remaining anchored to a single industrial center was no longer sufficient. The Mellons did not abandon Pittsburgh, but they supplemented it, placing residences where decisions were made, policies were written, and culture was validated. Their houses began to function less as homes in the traditional sense and more as forward operating bases in a national system of power. New York was the first and most obvious destination. By the 1910s and 1920s, Manhattan had become the nerve center of American finance. Banks, investment houses, and corporate headquarters clustered within a few square miles, and proximity mattered. The Mellons acquired New York residences not to participate in society in the flamboyant sense associated with Fifth Avenue balls and headlines, but to maintain quiet access to capital networks that increasingly shaped the global economy. These townhouses were formal, discreet, and carefully positioned. They allowed the family to operate within the financial elite without surrendering privacy or adopting the ostentatious culture of New York high society. In New York, as elsewhere, Mellon architecture reflected discipline. The houses were large but not theatrical, imposing but not experimental. Classical proportions, conservative interiors, and controlled spaces defined their character. These were not residences designed to impress strangers. They were designed to host private meetings, confidential conversations, and carefully curated gatherings of equals. The Mellon presence in New York signaled stability. In a city known for speculation, volatility, and rapid turnover of fortunes, the Mellons projected endurance. Washington, D.C. served a different but equally important function. If New York was the engine of finance, Washington was the mechanism of legitimacy. Andrew Mellon's long tenure as Secretary of the Treasury required a permanent presence in the capital, but it also demanded discretion. Political power in Washington operated differently than industrial or financial power. Visibility invited scrutiny. Excess invited criticism. Mellon's Washington residence was therefore calibrated to its environment. It was formal without being extravagant, authoritative without being conspicuous. Living in Washington placed Mellon at the center of American governance during a transformative period. The federal government was expanding its reach into economic life, regulating markets, collecting income taxes, and shaping international trade. Mellon's influence was both administrative and philosophical. He believed deeply in order, efficiency, and predictability, and his domestic environment reflected those values. His Washington home was a space of containment, where public responsibility and private authority intersected without spectacle. The placement of Mellon residences in New York and Washington illustrates a broader shift in how elite families used architecture. In the 19th century, houses had primarily expressed wealth. In the 20th, they expressed alignment. Location communicated allegiance to systems of power rather than to local communities. A Mellon townhouse in Manhattan or residence in Washington was not about belonging to a neighborhood. It was about occupying a position within a national hierarchy. These homes also functioned as buffers. The Mellons were acutely aware of the political risks associated with great wealth. Progressive reformers, journalists, and politicians increasingly scrutinized industrial fortunes, questioning their legitimacy and calling for redistribution. By embedding themselves within the cultural and political establishment of the East Coast, the Mellons insulated themselves from populist backlash. Their residences became spaces where wealth could appear responsible, cultivated, and aligned with national interests rather than private gain. Cultural capital played a growing role in this strategy. In both New York and Washington, Mellon residences housed significant art collections. Paintings, sculptures, and rare objects were not merely decorations. They were symbols of stewardship. They suggested that Mellon wealth served a higher purpose than accumulation. This framing was crucial in cities where opinion and policy were shaped. Art softened power. It translated money into taste and taste into legitimacy. The Washington years, in particular, marked a turning point. Mellon's collecting intensified, and the distinction between private residence and public institution began to blur. The art that filled his home increasingly felt too important, too symbolic, to remain private indefinitely. The idea that great collections should ultimately belong to the nation took root. This was not a sudden revelation, but the logical extension of the Mellon philosophy. Wealth, once secured, should stabilize rather than provoke. Giving art to the public was a way of converting private power into national heritage. New York and Washington also revealed the limits of urban living for a family seeking control and permanence. Even elite neighborhoods were subject to change. Traffic increased. Cities grew louder, denser, more visible. Privacy required constant management. For the Mellons, whose wealth no longer depended on daily oversight, urban residences began to feel transitional rather than final. They served specific functions, but they did not offer the insulation or timelessness that true dynastic security demanded. This realization did not diminish the importance of these homes. On the contrary, it clarified their purpose. Mellon residences in New York and Washington were instruments, not sanctuaries. They allowed the family to operate at the highest levels of finance and government while preserving the option of withdrawal. They were places of access, not retreat. The contrast between these urban residences and what would follow is essential. In Pittsburgh, the Mellons had lived near the source of their fortune. In New York and Washington, they lived near the levers of national power. The next phase would take them somewhere else entirely, into landscapes chosen not for proximity to influence, but for distance from it. The eastward movement was therefore incomplete. It was a necessary step in a longer journey towards seclusion. By the late 1920s, the Mellon family had achieved what few American dynasties ever managed. They were embedded simultaneously in industry, finance, politics, and culture. Their houses reflected this multi-layered authority. Each residence was calibrated to its environment, serving a specific function within a broader system. None were accidental. None were purely personal. Section 4 of the Mellon Mansion story reveals how architecture followed power as it migrated. The family's homes in New York and Washington were not symbols of arrival, but tools of governance. They marked the moment when Mellon wealth ceased to be regional and became national, when private fortunes aligned themselves with the architecture of the American state. What remained unresolved was the question of where the family truly belonged. The answer would not be found on city streets or political corridors, but on land vast enough to promise something cities never could: control without exposure, permanence without proximity, and legacy without noise. By the time the Mellon family turned decisively toward the countryside, the move was neither impulsive nor aesthetic alone. It was ideological. Urban residences had served their function, but they were ultimately reactive spaces, shaped by surrounding forces the family could not fully control. Cities changed too quickly. Governments shifted. Public attention drifted unpredictably. For a dynasty intent on permanence, true security required land vast, privately controlled, and geographically insulated. The great Mellon country estates were born from this realization, and with them came a new chapter in the family's architectural story, one defined by scale, seclusion, and quiet authority. The countryside offered what no city ever could: distance. Distance from scrutiny, distance from unrest, and distance from the volatile rhythms of industrial capitalism. For the Mellons, whose wealth had already reached a level where daily oversight was unnecessary, withdrawal did not mean disengagement. It meant control exercised from afar. Country estates allowed the family to exist, above the noise of public life while remaining deeply embedded in the systems that governed it. These estates were not escapes. They were command centers disguised as retreats. Land acquisition became central to this strategy. Large tracts were purchased not only for beauty or prestige, but for the power inherent in ownership itself. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of acres ensured privacy by default. Access could be regulated. Sightlines could be managed. Roads, gates, and long drives created psychological distance as well as physical separation. Approaching a Mellon estate was never accidental. It was intentional, deliberate, and controlled from the moment one left the public road. The architecture of these estates reflected a careful balance between American ambition and European tradition. The Mellons did not invent new styles. They selected established ones, particularly those associated with permanence and aristocratic continuity. Classical, Georgian, and Beaux-Arts influences dominated, drawing on architectural languages that had already endured centuries. This was a conscious rejection of novelty. Innovation suggested instability. Tradition suggested inevitability. Unlike the flamboyant palaces built by some Gilded Age industrialists, Mellon country houses rarely indulged in excess for its own sake. Their grandeur was restrained, measured through proportion rather than ornament. Facades emphasized symmetry. Interiors prioritized order. Even the most luxurious rooms conveyed discipline rather than indulgence. These houses were designed to feel settled the moment they were completed, as though they had always been there and always would be. Inside, the estates functioned as self-contained wards. Staff quarters, service corridors, and operational spaces were meticulously planned to keep domestic labor invisible. The smooth operation of the household was essential to preserving the illusion of effortlessness. Guests were meant to experience calm, continuity, and control, never the machinery required to sustain it. This separation reinforced social hierarchies while maintaining an atmosphere of cultivated ease. The countryside also allowed the Mellons to integrate architecture with landscape in ways impossible in urban environments. Lawns, gardens, woodlands, and water features were not decorative afterthoughts. They were extensions of authority. Landscaped grounds imposed order on nature itself, transforming raw land into curated terrain. Long vistas and controlled sightlines reinforced the sense of dominance. Not through aggression, but through calm mastery, these estates became the true stage for Mellon family life. Here, generations were raised within an environment that reinforced continuity and expectation. Children grew up surrounded by symbols of permanence, absorbing the idea that the family's position was not temporary or negotiable. The estate was not just a home. It was a lesson teaching through scale, routine, and repetition that stability was the family's highest value. Social life within these properties was equally deliberate. Gatherings were intimate, selective, and purposeful. Invitations signaled inclusion within a closed world, one governed by shared assumptions about power, responsibility, and discretion. These were not houses for spectacle or public display. They were spaces for reinforcing alliances, maintaining networks, and ensuring that influence circulated quietly among trusted participants. The country estates also reflected the Mellon family's evolving relationship with American identity. As industrialists, their wealth had been distinctly modern, tied to factories, markets, and financial innovation. As landowners, they adopted an older, almost pre-industrial posture, one that echoed European aristocracy. This dual identity allowed the Mellons to position themselves as both architects of modern America and guardians of its cultural refinement. Yet this transformation was not without contradiction. The estates were built using wealth extracted from industries that reshaped landscapes, polluted rivers, and disrupted communities. The serene environments the Mellons cultivated stood in stark contrast to the industrial regions that financed them. This tension was rarely acknowledged within the estate wars. Distance made it possible to forget the origins of comfort, replacing memory with tranquility. As the Great Depression approached, the value of this insulation became clear. Economic collapse exposed the fragility of many fortunes, but the Mellons remained largely protected. Their wealth was diversified, institutionalized, and embedded in land as well as finance. Country estates, far from being liabilities, became symbols of endurance. While urban centers struggled, these properties projected stability, reinforcing the impression that the Mellon dynasty existed on a different plane. Governed by longer timelines and deeper reserves. The estates also provided a setting for reflection and consolidation. As Andrew Mellon aged, he increasingly retreated from public life, spending more time within these controlled environments. Decisions made here carried national consequences, but the setting remained calm, insulated from the urgency of political debate or market panic. The countryside allowed power to feel serene, even when its effects were anything but. Section 5 marks the moment when the Mellon mansion story reaches its most fully realized form. The country estate was not simply the largest or most beautiful expression of Mellon wealth. It was the most honest. Here, the family's values, control, restraint, permanence, and discretion were translated into physical reality. Every gate, pathway, and wall reinforced the same message. This was a dynasty that intended not just to succeed, but to endure. By rooting themselves in land rather than cities, the Mellons completed their transformation from industrial financiers to landed elites. Their estates did not announce triumph. They implied inevitability. And in doing so, they achieved what few American families ever have: the conversion of money into landscape, influence into environment, and fortune into something that felt immovable. The mansions were no longer responses to success. They were monuments to continuity, built to outlast the era that created them and to anchor the Mellon name deep within the American terrain itself. As the Mellon family's country estates reached maturity, a new force quietly reshaped their meaning. Art, what had begun as a pursuit of cultural legitimacy, evolved into one of the most significant private collecting efforts in American history. For the Mellons, art was never an accessory. It was a system of translation, converting industrial wealth into historical authority. Within the walls of their mansions, paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, and rare objects served a purpose that extended far beyond aesthetics. They were instruments of permanence, designed to anchor the family within a lineage of civilization that predated American capitalism itself. Andrew Mellon's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. Reserved by nature and deeply skeptical of publicity, he found in art a language that allowed expression without exposure. Collecting offered a form of control that mirrored finance. Works could be acquired methodically, studied intensely, and placed within carefully ordered environments. Each acquisition was deliberate. Each placement was calculated. The mansion became not merely a residence but a private museum, where taste replaced spectacle and scholarship replaced display. The estates were uniquely suited to this role. Their scale allowed for entire wings devoted to galleries, libraries, and studies. Light was managed with precision. Walls were proportioned for masterworks rather than decoration. Furniture receded into the background, subordinate to the art itself. Visitors were not meant to be overwhelmed by luxury, but guided through a narrative of cultural continuity. The architecture framed the collection, and the collection, in turn, justified the architecture. European art held particular significance. Old master paintings carried centuries of accumulated prestige, linking the Mellons symbolically to royal patrons, ecclesiastical power, and aristocratic tradition. In a nation still young and culturally insecure, such associations mattered. Displaying European masterpieces within American estates suggested that history itself had crossed the Atlantic and taken root. The Mellons were not merely wealthy Americans. They were participants in a longer civilizational story, Yet this collecting was not motivated by vanity alone. Mellon approached art with the same analytical rigor he applied to finance. He studied provenance, authenticity, and historical context. Advisors, dealers, and scholars were consulted extensively. The goal was not quantity, but coherence. Each piece needed to belong within a larger intellectual framework. This methodical approach distinguished the Mellon collection from the more impulsive accumulations of some contemporaries. Within the mansion, art shaped daily life. Rooms were organized around works of significance, turning routine movement through the house into an encounter with history. Libraries housed rare books and manuscripts, reinforcing the image of scholarship and stewardship. These spaces encouraged contemplation rather than celebration. They were quiet, controlled, and deeply private, reflecting the Mellon temperament. The presence of art also altered how the family interacted with guests. Invitations were extended selectively, often to individuals who could appreciate the collection intellectually rather than socially. Conversations unfolded around paintings and artifacts, shifting focus away from wealth itself toward ideas, history, and culture. This dynamic elevated the social function of the mansion, transforming it into a site of cultural exchange rather than entertainment. As the collection expanded, a tension emerged between private ownership and public responsibility. Masterpieces of increasing importance occupied private rooms, accessible to only a handful of viewers. For a family that valued stability and legitimacy, this exclusivity posed a philosophical dilemma. Art, by its nature, demanded an audience. Its power derived not only from possession, but from recognition. The question of what would ultimately happen to these works became unavoidable. This tension coincided with a broader shift in American attitudes toward philanthropy. Wealthy families were increasingly expected to justify their fortunes through public benefit. Foundations, museums, and universities became mechanisms for converting private capital into social authority. For the Mellons, art offered a uniquely effective pathway. It aligned perfectly with their existing values, requiring no change in temperament, only a change in destination. The decision to transform a private collection into a public institution was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, shaped by reflection, planning, and negotiation with the state. The mansion, once the final destination of Mellon wealth, began to feel transitional. Art outgrew domestic boundaries. What had once legitimized private life now demanded a public stage. This realization culminated in the creation of the National Gallery of Art. The museum was not merely a gift. It was a translation. Works acquired within the privacy of Mellon estates were repositioned at the heart of the nation's capital, where they could serve a broader purpose. The architecture of the gallery echoed the same values as the mansion's: classical, restrained, authoritative. It projected permanence without ostentation. Mirroring the Mellon approach on a national scale, the transfer of art from mansion to museum fundamentally altered the meaning of the estates themselves. Rooms once centered on masterpieces were redefined. Some spaces emptied, others adapted. The mansions remained symbols of legacy, but their cultural gravity shifted outward. What had been concentrated within private walls now radiated publicly, extending Mellon influence beyond family boundaries. This act of philanthropy reshaped the family's historical image. Industrial wealth, once associated with exploitation and inequality, was reframed as cultural guardianship. The Mellons were no longer merely beneficiaries of capitalism's excesses. They became patrons of civilization, protectors of beauty and knowledge. The mansion, in retrospect, appeared not as an endpoint, but as an incubator for public legacy. Yet even as art left the estates, the philosophy behind its collection remained embedded in the family's architecture. The mansions continued to emphasize order, proportion, and restraint. They were designed to accommodate contemplation, whether or not masterpieces adorned every wall. The aesthetic discipline cultivated through years of collecting influenced every aspect of domestic life. From interior design to daily routine. Section 6 reveals how the Mellon mansion story transcended architecture. These houses were not merely shelters for wealth or symbols of status. They were instruments in a larger process of transformation, converting private fortune into cultural authority. Art provided the bridge between money and meaning, between possession and legitimacy. By integrating art so deeply into their estates, the Mellons redefined what a mansion could be. It was no longer just a residence or a retreat. It was a cultural engine, a place where history was gathered, interpreted, and eventually released into the public sphere. In doing so, the family ensured that their legacy would not be measured solely in dollars or land, but in the enduring presence of beauty and knowledge within the national consciousness. As the Mellon dynasty extended into new generations, the great mansions and estates they inherited began to reveal a quieter, more complicated truth. Buildings designed to project permanence also imposed expectations. They carried with them an invisible weight, shaping identity before individual choice could assert itself. For the children and grandchildren of Andrew Mellon, growing up within these carefully ordered environments meant inheriting not only wealth, but a fully constructed narrative about who they were supposed to become. Section 7 of the Mellon story is not about expansion or acquisition. It is about life inside the legacy. From an early age, Mellon heirs were immersed in surroundings that communicated authority and restraint without words. The scale of the houses alone made clear that these were not ordinary lives. Long corridors, formal dining rooms, libraries filled with rare volumes, and grounds that stretched beyond sight created a sense of distance from the outside world. Childhood unfolded in spaces designed for continuity rather than comfort, where routine mattered more than spontaneity and privacy was structured rather than assumed. Education was treated as a duty rather than an option. Tutors, elite schools, and carefully curated cultural exposure were standard. Art, history, and finance were not hobbies. They were inheritances. The mansions themselves functioned as classrooms, reinforcing lessons about hierarchy, taste, and control. Every room, every painting, every ritualized meal communicated the same underlying message. This world existed because it had been built carefully, and it would endure only if managed with equal discipline. Yet these environments could also feel isolating. The very features that insulated the family from public scrutiny created emotional distance as well. Social interactions were limited, often filtered through family approval and social expectations. Friendships with peers outside the elite world were rare and sometimes discouraged. The estate became both refuge and enclosure, offering safety at the cost of exposure to ordinary experience. As heirs matured, the question of responsibility loomed large. Wealth on this scale demanded stewardship. Trusts, foundations, and corporate interests required oversight. The mansions, with their offices, libraries, and meeting rooms, became spaces where family members were gradually introduced to governance. Decisions made within these walls affected industries, communities, and institutions far beyond the estate gates. The domestic sphere blurred into the administrative. Not all heirs responded to this inheritance in the same way. Some embraced their roles, finding purpose in philanthropy, finance, or cultural leadership. For them, the mansions were affirmations, tangible proof of a lineage worth preserving. Others struggled against the expectations embedded in stone and landscape. For these individuals, the estates could feel suffocating, symbols of a life already scripted. Generational shifts also altered how these houses were used. The rigid formality of early 20th century elite life began to soften after World War II. Social hierarchies loosened. American culture grew more informal, more mobile, and less deferential. The mansions, designed for an earlier era, sometimes seemed out of step with the world beyond their gates. Maintaining them required not only financial resources, but emotional commitment to values that were increasingly questioned. This tension revealed itself in subtle changes. Some rooms were repurposed. Formal spaces fell into occasional use rather than daily ritual. Staff sizes fluctuated. The machinery that had once made estate life seamless became harder to justify in a changing social climate. Yet, even as practices evolved, the core architecture remained, anchoring the family to its past. philanthropy offered a pathway for reconciling legacy with modernity. For younger Mellons, charitable work provided a sense of agency within an inherited structure. Foundations, educational initiatives, and cultural institutions allowed them to exert influence without replicating the industrial capitalism that had created the fortune. The mansion became a base for this work, a place where strategy and reflection could coexist. The estates also shaped family dynamics. Large houses allowed for physical separation within shared space. Multiple wings, private quarters, and secluded gardens enabled independence without departure. This arrangement preserved unity while accommodating individuality, a delicate balance for any dynasty. Conflicts could be contained. Differences could coexist under one roof, buffered by architecture. Marriage introduced another layer of complexity. New family members brought different expectations, backgrounds, and relationships to wealth. The mansion became a proving ground, testing whether outsiders could adapt to its rhythms and constraints. Acceptance often depended less on affection than on compatibility with the estate's unspoken rules. The house itself functioned as an arbiter, rewarding those who navigated its codes and isolating those who did not. As decades passed, mortality reshaped the meaning of these spaces. Rooms once associated with powerful figures became memorials. Portraits, furniture, and art carried the presence of those who had lived and decided there. The mansion accumulated memory as much as wealth, turning into an archive of family history. For descendants, living within these walls meant constant proximity to the past, a reminder of standards set and paths taken. Section 7 exposes the human dimension of the Mellon mansion story. Behind the facades of control and permanence were individuals negotiating identity, obligation, and freedom. The estates did not merely shelter the family. They shaped them, reinforcing some traits while suppressing others. Architecture became psychology, influencing behavior through space, routine, and expectation. By the mid-20th century, it was clear that the greatest challenge facing the Mellon dynasty was not preservation of wealth, but adaptation of meaning. The mansions had succeeded in anchoring the family in history. The question now was whether they could remain relevant in a society increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege. For the Mellons, the answer would determine whether their houses remained living environments or slowly transformed into relics of an earlier America. This section marks a turning inward. The story of the Mellon mansions is no longer just about power projected outward, but about lives lived within its boundaries. It is here, in the quiet routines of inherited spaces, that the true cost and complexity of legacy become visible. By the late 20th century, the world that had produced the Mellon mansions no longer existed in recognizable form. Industrial capitalism had evolved into global finance. Deference to inherited power had eroded. Public attitudes toward extreme wealth had hardened, and the practical realities of maintaining vast private estates grew increasingly difficult to justify. Section 8 of the Mellon story is defined by this reckoning. The mansions that once symbolized control and continuity now faced a different question. What happens to monuments of permanence when the culture that created them moves on? The first challenge was economic, and it was relentless. Even for a family of immense resources, the cost of maintaining large estates became increasingly disproportionate to their usefulness. Taxes rose. Labor costs increased. Skilled staff capable of preserving historic buildings grew scarce. Systems designed for an earlier era, heating, plumbing, roofing, and grounds maintenance required constant intervention. What had once been seamless now demanded attention. The illusion of effortlessness cracked. At the same time, social norms shifted. The large household staff that had made estate life possible became less common and less socially acceptable. Privacy expectations changed. The rigid hierarchies embedded in estate life felt outdated in a more egalitarian society. Younger generations, raised in a world of mobility and choice, questioned the necessity of maintaining properties that tied them physically and symbolically to the past. This tension forced a reevaluation of purpose. Mansions that had once been lived-in environments increasingly became underutilized. Entire wings sat empty. Formal rooms were opened only on special occasions. The estate shifted from being a center of daily life to a symbol visited intermittently. In this transition, the houses themselves began to change roles, moving gradually from private residences to historical artifacts. For some Mellon properties, adaptation offered a solution. Estates were repurposed as cultural institutions, research centers, or public attractions. Opening gates to the public was not an act of surrender, but a strategic recalibration. It allowed the family to retain ownership or influence while transferring operational responsibility to foundations, trusts, or public entities. The mansion ceased to be a private sanctuary and became a shared inheritance. This transformation required careful framing. Public access had to align with the Mellon narrative of stewardship rather than decline. Tours emphasized architectural significance, artistic value, and historical context. Industrial origins were often softened, reframed within broader stories of American development and philanthropy. The estate's survival depended not just on funding, but on interpretation. Other properties followed a different path. Some were sold, subdivided, or demolished, casualties of changing economics and tastes. These losses were rarely dramatic, but they were significant. Each disappearance marked the erosion of a physical link to the family's past. The decision to let go of a mansion was never merely financial. It was emotional, symbolic, and often contentious within the family. Internal debates reflected broader cultural uncertainty. Was preserving every estate an obligation or a burden? Did legacy require physical continuity, or could it survive through institutions and ideas alone? For a family that had long equated permanence with property, these questions cut deeply. The mansions had been tools of stability. Now they threatened to become anchors. Preservation movements added another layer of complexity. As historic value replaced private function, external stakeholders emerged. Preservationists, local governments, and historians asserted claims over properties once governed solely by family will. Regulations limited alterations. Expectations of access increased. Ownership became shared in practice if not in law. The family's control over its own legacy became negotiated rather than absolute. Yet even as authority diffused, the Mellon imprint endured. Estates that entered public life carried with them the values embedded in their design. Visitors encountered spaces defined by order, restraint, and proportion. Landscapes still communicated control, even when freely accessible. Architecture continued to shape experience, transmitting a worldview long after its creators had passed. This period also revealed a paradox. As the Mellons withdrew from private estate life, their public legacy grew stronger. Museums, universities, and foundations associated with the family expanded their influence. The National Gallery of Art, funded and shaped by Mellon vision, became a cornerstone of American cultural life. In contrast to fragile mansions, these institutions proved resilient, adaptable, and widely supported. The shift suggested a deeper truth. Buildings tied to private life were vulnerable to cultural change. Institutions designed for public benefit were not. The family's long-term survival as a historical force depended less on preserving every wall and more on sustaining ideas. In this light, the gradual fading of some mansions did not represent failure, but evolution. Still, loss carried weight. Walking through a partially preserved estate or viewing photographs of a demolished mansion revealed the gap between intention and outcome. These houses had been built to outlast generations. That some could not underscored the limits of control, even for a dynasty as disciplined as the Mellons. Time proved to be the ultimate authority. Section 8 captures the moment when permanence met impermanence. The mansions, once instruments of certainty, became subjects of negotiation, adaptation, and sometimes surrender. They entered a new phase of existence shaped as much by public memory as by private will. In doing so, they mirrored the broader American story, in which old structures are continually reassessed, repurposed, or allowed to disappear. What survived was not uniform. Some estates thrived as living cultural sites. Others lingered as fragments. Some vanished entirely, but collectively, they traced the arc of a family learning that legacy could no longer rely solely on land and stone. It had to be flexible, distributable, and open to reinterpretation. The Mellon mansions did not fail. They changed function. They moved from centers of life to vessels of memory, from private fortresses to public texts. In that transformation, they revealed the final challenge of dynastic ambition, not how to build something lasting, but how to let it endure beyond the context that made it powerful in the first place. As the physical presence of the Mellon mansions evolved, their symbolic power began to operate on a different level. No longer confined to private life or even to specific locations, the idea of the Mellon estate entered the realm of collective memory. Section 9 is about what remained after gates opened, rooms emptied, and family life receded. It is about how architecture, once designed to project control, transformed into a narrative framework through which the Mellon dynasty would be remembered, interpreted, and judged. Public memory does not preserve buildings as they were lived in. It simplifies, edits, and assigns meaning. When former Mellon properties became museums, archives, or historic sites, they were reframed for audiences who had no personal connection to the family. Guides, plaques, and curated exhibits translated private spaces into stories. Choices were made about what to emphasize and what to omit. Grandeur was often foregrounded. Labor, hierarchy, and industrial origins receded into the background. The mansion became a symbol of elegance rather than a system of power. This transformation was not unique to the Mellons, but their disciplined aesthetic made it especially effective. Visitors encountered environments that felt orderly, calm, and timeless. The absence of visible excess allowed admiration to replace resentment. The houses appeared dignified rather than indulgent, reinforcing the family's long-cultivated image of restraint. In public memory, the Mellon mansion became less a product of capitalism and more a monument to culture. Architecture played a decisive role in shaping this perception. Classical proportions, symmetrical layouts, and restrained ornamentation communicated stability and authority even to those unfamiliar with architectural history. The buildings spoke a universal language of order. They suggested seriousness of purpose. In a society that often equates chaos with decline, this visual discipline carried moral weight. Landscapes contributed as well. Expansive lawns, carefully managed gardens, and controlled vistas conveyed harmony between human intention and nature. Visitors experienced these environments as peaceful, not as assertions of dominance. The original message of control softened into one of stewardship. What had once been private mastery over land became, in memory, a gift of beauty to the public. This reframing extended to the family itself. Andrew Mellon, once a controversial figure due to his role in shaping tax policy and federal finance, increasingly appeared in historical narratives as a patron of the arts. His political influence faded in comparison to the enduring presence of institutions he helped create. The mansions, stripped of daily life, functioned as visual footnotes to this philanthropic legacy, yet memory is selective and selection has consequences. The labor systems that sustained estate life rarely occupied central space in public interpretation. Domestic workers, groundskeepers, and service staff became background figures if they appeared at all. The human cost of maintaining order remained largely invisible. In this way, the mansion continued to perform its original function, masking the machinery behind its smooth surfaces. As the physical presence of the Mellon mansions evolved, their symbolic power began to operate on a different level. No longer confined to private life or even to specific locations, the idea of the Mellon estate entered the realm of collective memory. Section 9 is about what remained after gates opened, rooms emptied, and family life receded. It is about how architecture, once designed to project control, transformed into a narrative framework through which the Mellon dynasty would be remembered, interpreted, and judged. Public memory does not preserve buildings as they were lived in. It simplifies, edits, and assigns meaning. When former Mellon properties became museums, archives, or historic sites, they were reframed for audiences who had no personal connection to the family. Guides, plaques, and curated exhibits translated private spaces into stories. Choices were made about what to emphasize and what to omit. Grandeur was often foregrounded. Labor, hierarchy, and industrial origins receded into the background. The mansion became a symbol of elegance rather than a system of power. This transformation was not unique to the Mellons, but their disciplined aesthetic made it especially effective. Visitors encountered environments that felt orderly, calm, and timeless. The absence of visible excess allowed admiration to replace resentment. The houses appeared dignified rather than indulgent, reinforcing the family's long-cultivated image of restraint. In public memory, the Mellon mansion became less a product of capitalism and more a monument to culture. Architecture played a decisive role in shaping this perception. Classical proportions, symmetrical layouts, and restrained ornamentation communicated stability and authority even to those unfamiliar with architectural history. The buildings spoke a universal language of order. They suggested seriousness of purpose. In a society that often equates chaos with decline, this visual discipline carried moral weight. Landscapes contributed as well. Expansive lawns, carefully managed gardens, and controlled vistas conveyed harmony between human intention and nature. Visitors experienced these environments as peaceful, not as assertions of dominance. The original message of control softened into one of stewardship. What had once been private mastery over land became, in memory, a gift of beauty to the public. This reframing extended to the family itself. Andrew Mellon, once a controversial figure due to his role in shaping tax policy and federal finance, increasingly appeared in historical narratives as a patron of the arts. His political influence faded in comparison to the enduring presence of institutions he helped create. The mansion, stripped of daily life, functioned as visual footnotes to this philanthropic legacy. Yet memory is selective and selection has consequences. The labor systems that sustained estate life rarely occupied central space in public interpretation. Domestic workers, groundskeepers, and service staff became background figures if they appeared at all. The human cost of maintaining order remained largely invisible. In this way, the mansion continued to perform its original function, masking the machinery behind its smooth surfaces. At the same time, scholars and critics began to revisit these sites with more critical eyes. Architectural historians, social theorists, and cultural critics questioned what these houses represented beyond beauty. They examined how space enforced hierarchy, how design naturalized inequality, and how architecture functioned as a political tool. The Mellon mansions became case studies, not just in style, but in power. This dual interpretation created tension. To some, the estates were treasures deserving preservation. To others, they were artifacts of an unequal past. Public institutions managing former Mellon properties had to navigate this divide carefully. Interpretation evolved, incorporating broader social context without alienating audiences drawn by aesthetics. The mansion became a site of conversation rather than consensus. As time passed, the family's direct presence in these narratives diminished. Names remained on plaques and foundations, but living memory faded. The houses took on lives of their own, shaped by visitors rather than residents. Weddings, exhibitions, lectures, and tours layered new experiences onto old spaces. The mansion became adaptable, absorbing contemporary meanings while retaining historical form. This adaptability ensured survival. Buildings that resisted reinterpretation risked irrelevance. Those that embraced it remained active. In this sense, the Mellon mansions demonstrated a final form of resilience. Designed for permanence, they achieved it not by freezing time, but by allowing meaning to evolve. In the end, the story of the Mellon family mansions is not simply a story about buildings, wealth, or taste. It is a study in how power attempts to make itself permanent and how time ultimately reshapes that ambition. Section 10 brings the narrative to its widest frame, stepping back from individual estates to examine what the Mellons sought to achieve through architecture, and what their mansions reveal about the American experiment itself. The Mellons did not build recklessly. From the beginning, their approach to wealth was defined by discipline, restraint, and long horizons. Money was accumulated quietly, invested methodically, and protected institutionally. When architecture entered the picture, it did so as an extension of this philosophy. The mansions were never meant to be loud. They were meant to last. In a nation defined by speed, innovation, and constant reinvention, the Mellons attempted something almost countercultural. They tried to slow time. Through land, stone, and proportion, they sought to convert financial dominance into historical presence. This impulse was not uniquely American. European aristocracies had pursued it for centuries. What made the Mellon effort distinctive was its timing and context. They attempted to graft an old-world model of permanence onto a young republic built on mobility and equality. The mansions were experiments, testing whether inherited stability could take root in American soil. For a time, they succeeded. The estates insulated the family from economic volatility, political backlash, and social change. They provided continuity across generations and projected an image of inevitability. They anchored the Mellon name in geography and culture, making it harder to dislodge. Architecture did what markets alone could not. It made power visible, legible, and seemingly timeless. Yet the American context imposed limits. Unlike European nobility, American dynasties lacked formal titles, legal privileges, and inherited political authority. Their legitimacy depended on public tolerance. As attitudes toward wealth shifted, architecture alone could not guarantee acceptance. The mansions endured, but their meaning changed. What had once symbolized authority came to represent history. What had once signaled control came to invite interpretation. This shift does not diminish the Mellon achievement. On the contrary, it clarifies it. The family understood, perhaps better than most, that wealth without narrative is fragile. By investing in architecture, art, and institutions, they constructed a story that could survive scrutiny. Even when individual estates faded from private use, the broader narrative held that the ultimate success of the Mellon strategy lies less in the survival of specific mansions and more in the durability of their cultural footprint. Museums, universities, foundations, and preserved estates continue to shape American intellectual and artistic life. These institutions outlast any single building. They translate private ambition into public value, ensuring relevance beyond family lineage. The mansions viewed collectively become chapters in this larger story. Some remain intact, others altered, others lost. Together, they trace an arc from industrial capitalism to cultural stewardship, from private control to public memory. They reveal how architecture can mediate between wealth and society, softening the edges of inequality without erasing its origins. At the same time, the story resists easy moral conclusions. The Mellon mansions are neither purely admirable nor purely problematic. They are complex artifacts of their time. They embody both discipline and exclusion, beauty and hierarchy, stewardship and control. Their legacy forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about how wealth operates and how it seeks legitimacy. In this sense, the Mellons achieved something rare. They created structures capable of sustaining contradiction. Their buildings invite admiration while encouraging critique. They endure not because they are beyond question, but because they remain relevant to questions that persist. As physical spaces, the mansions remind us that power once required walls, land, and distance. As cultural symbols, they show how power adapts, dispersing into institutions and narratives when walls are no longer enough. The transition from private estate to public memory marks not a failure, but an evolution consistent with the family's original pragmatism. The American experiment has always balanced ambition with reinvention. Fortunes rise and fall. Names fade and reemerge. The Mellons understood this dynamic and attempted to stabilize their position within it. Their mansions were tools in that effort, designed to slow erosion and anchor meaning. That they could not freeze time does not negate their purpose. It affirms the limits of control in a society defined by change. Section 10 closes the story by returning to the central question that has run quietly through every estate, every corridor, and every decision. What does it mean to last? For the Mellons, the answer was not found solely in money, land, or stone. It emerged in the willingness to adapt legacy to circumstance, to convert private success into public significance. Today, when visitors walk through former Mellon estates or stand before institutions shaped by Mellon patronage, they encounter more than architecture. They encounter a philosophy rendered in space, order without flamboyance, permanence without arrogance, influence without noise. These qualities explain why the Mellon name remains present long after the era that produced it is past. The mansions do not speak loudly, but they endure. They stand as reminders that in America, power is never static. It must continually justify itself, reinterpret itself, and ultimately share itself to survive. In this negotiation between ambition and accountability, the Mellon family left behind more than houses. They left a blueprint for how wealth attempts to write itself into history, and how history in turn edits the final draft.